Ever wonder why some nations just seem to cruise along, economically speaking, while others, well, not so much?
Yeah, it's a question that's puzzled people for ages, hasn't it?
Totally. So today, we're taking a deep dive into that very question, guided by this fascinating book, Why Nations Fail, by Duran Acemoglu and James Robinson.
It's a good one. Really makes you think.
Okay, so set the stage for us. What's the central argument here? What makes some nations prosper while others,
Well, it's tempting to point at things like geography, right? Or maybe culture. But our authors, they make a pretty compelling case that it all boils down to, get this, institutions.
Institutions. Okay, and I'm guessing they're not talking about the brick and mortar kind.
You got it. Think of it more like the rules of the game, yeah? The stuff that shapes how a society actually functions. Laws, property rights, for sure, but also like those unwritten rules.
Like social norms, how power actually shakes out, that sort of thing.
Bingo. And they break these institutions down into two main flavors. You ready for this? Extractive and inclusive.
Ooh, this sounds pretty loaded.
Oh, they definitely are.
Okay, break it down for me. Extractive versus inclusive. What's the difference?
All right, so picture a system where a tiny elite, right? They're skimming off the top, hoarding all the wealth and power. They're extracting resources from everyone else. Hence the name extractive.
Right, classic case of the rich get richer.
And the poor, well,
Yeah, not so much. And I'm guessing inclusive institutions are the flip side of that.
you got it.
Yeah.
Think fair laws, property rights that actually mean something, open markets where, you could actually start a business without having to like bribe the entire government.
So a system that's designed to benefit, more than just the folks at the very tippy top.
Exactly. It's about spreading the wealth, the opportunities more broadly.
Okay, I'm with you. So are Acemoglu and Robinson saying these institutions, these rules of the game, they're even more important than like a country's natural resources,
Yeah.
climate, even its history and culture?
It might sound kind of crazy at first, but yeah, that's exactly what they're arguing.
So it's not just about the hand you're dealt, but the rules you play by.
Now you're getting it.
Okay, I'm hooked. So to drive this point home, they dive into some pretty fascinating historical comparisons, right?
Oh, yeah. Tons of them.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they talk about the early colonization of North and South America, which is super interesting.
Okay, because you just assume the U.S. was always dominant, right?
Right. But get this. Up until like the 18th century, parts of Latin America were actually wealthier. Can you believe that?
No way, seriously.
Yeah. They had tons of gold, those established civilizations like the Inca and the Aztecs.
Wow, I did not know that. So what happened? Did they just like completely mismanage their resources or something?
That's where those all-important institutions come in. See, when the Spanish conquistadors showed up, they found these sophisticated, centralized empires, right? Ripe for the picking, basically.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So instead of building a system where everyone could benefit, they went the extractive route. Used their power to basically force the indigenous populations into labor, extracted all the gold and resources.
It's like colonial vampire bats.
Ouch. Okay, that's one way to put it.
Sorry. But so then what happened in North America? Different story, right?
Oh, totally different situation. For one thing, the English settlers who landed at Jamestown weren't exactly met with open arms and, mountains of gold.
No, definitely not.
And the Virginia Company, the folks who funded Jamestown, they tried to set up a similar extractive system, but it backfired. Big time.
How so?
They couldn't just waltz in and exploit an existing power structure, They needed the English settlers to actually do the work.
Right, because they didn't want to do it themselves, obviously.
Exactly. And those settlers, a lot of them came over seeking opportunity, autonomy, They weren't too keen on being treated like,
Slaves, basically.
Exactly. So their hand was kind of forced, They had to create a system that was at least somewhat more inclusive just to survive.
Fascinating. So they had to adapt or they would die.
Exactly. And that's how the headright system was born, giving settlers land, a real stake in the colony's success.
Which incentivizes people to work hard and, actually want the colony to succeed.
And there you have it, the early seeds of a very different kind of economy.
Wow. So just that initial difference in how those colonies were set up had this massive ripple effect across history.
It's wild, right? It's almost like those early choices, those institutions were like strands of DNA.
And they ended up shaping the entire genetic makeup of these two continents.
It's a powerful example of how those early choices, those institutions, they can echo through generations.
It really makes you wonder if these more inclusive institutions, if they work so well, Why do we still see so many of those extractive systems?
Yeah, throughout history, even today, right?
Right. Like, it's kind of a bummer to think about, honestly.
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And sadly, there's no easy answer.
Okay, so what do they say?
Well, Adusmaglu and Robinson, they dig into this, and honestly, it often boils down to a pretty simple, kind of depressing truth. The folks in power, they don't exactly give it up easily.
I mean, that makes sense, right? If you're, like, benefiting from the system, even if it's a rigged system.
You're not really incentivized to change it, are you?
Exactly. So how do they do it? Like, how do these extractive systems stay in power for so long?
Well, they've got a whole bag of tricks. Sometimes it's brute force, right? Coups, dictatorships, just, crushing any kind of dissent.
Right, make it impossible for anyone to disagree.
Exactly. Other times it's way more subtle, controlling the narrative, propaganda, limiting access to education.
So people can't even imagine an alternative.
Exactly. Basically, making it harder for people to even imagine a different system. They're just trying to survive.
Yeah, so you're too busy just trying to live. You don't have time to think about, like, hey, wait a minute, this system's rigged.
It's all about creating a system where, honestly, people are too busy just surviving to even question the rules of the game.
Mm.
And the really sneaky thing is that even when these extractive systems actually do manage to produce some economic growth,
It's usually short-lived.
exactly, temporary, unsustainable.
Okay, so like a sugar rush, a quick burst of energy, then you crash.
Perfect analogy. They talk about the Soviet Union.
Okay, yeah, it's a good example.
They achieved some incredible things, right?
Okay.
For a while, at least. Industrial might, military power.
But at what cost?
Exactly. And it came at a huge human cost. And eventually, their system, it was just too rigid, too top-down.
So when things started changing, they couldn't keep up.
Exactly. They just couldn't keep up with the more inclusive economies, with their innovation, their adaptability, and then,
Boom, collapse.
exactly.
So it's not just a moral argument, right? This is also about, like, long-term stability.
100%.
These extractive systems, yeah, they might seem to work for a little bit, but
But ultimately, they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot.
yeah, totally self-sabotaging in the long run.
Exactly. They create these really brittle structures that are very good at keeping things exactly the same.
But when the world inevitably changes.
Total recipe for disaster.
Okay, so this is all pretty bleak, but I'm sensing a but coming here. There are glimmers of hope, right?
Always.
Like Aximoglu and Robinson, they talk about these turning points where things shifted, where societies actually did move towards more inclusive systems.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They talk about the Glorious Revolution in England.
The big one, 1688, right? Okay, so give me the rundown. Why was this such a turning point?
Okay, so it wasn't perfect,
Mm.
right? And it wasn't like an overnight thing.
Things rarely are, right?
Definitely not. But it did lead to a more pluralistic system.
More voices at the table, so to speak.
Exactly. And the monarchy was more accountable to Parliament, to the people.
Instead of just like the king gets to decide everything.
Exactly. And this, my friend, paved the way for the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, so it's not like, some guy just woke up one day and was like, I'm going to invent the steam engine.
Right.
The soil had to be right, so to speak.
Think of it like this. The Glorious Revolution, it created the conditions where that kind of game-changing innovation could actually take root and flourish. And, this is a perfect example of what they call critical junctures.
Critical jump.
These pivotal moments in history. They could have, like, this massive impact on where a nation ends up going.
And we see the opposite of that happening in other parts of the world at the same time, right? Like the Ottoman Empire's ban on the printing press.
Oh, yeah. Talk about trying to put the genie back in the bottle.
It's like they saw this new technology and they were like, nope, too dangerous. This is going to, like, spread ideas, potentially undermine our authority.
Little did they know they were actually, like, stifling their own progress.
It seems almost comical in retrospect, you know what I mean? This fear of new ideas, of losing control, leading them to make a decision that would basically contribute to their own decline.
Yeah. It's wild, isn't it?
It shows how important it is to adapt, to evolve, especially when the whole world is changing around you. If you don't.
You get left behind.
So we've talked about how these historical forces, these institutions, have really shaped the destinies of nations. It's kind of a lot to take in. Where do we even go from here?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by all of it, right? Like, where do we even fit into all of this?
Totally, especially today with everything going on. It's like, every day there's a new headline that makes you want to just crawl under a rock.
I hear you. It's a lot. But here's the thing, and I think this is really important. Understanding the patterns of the past, seeing how these forces have actually played out, it can be empowering.
Okay, because knowledge is power.
Exactly. It's like having a map, right?
Okay, I like that analogy. Keep going.
You might not be able to control the terrain,
Right.
but knowing the lay of the land, the potential pitfalls, the best routes to take, that gives you a huge advantage. And that's why Nations Fail, I think, really offers.
Mm.
It's a roadmap. Like, this is how we understand how to actually build a better future.
Okay, I like that. So where do we even start? Like, what do if we want to, kind of like nudge things in a more inclusive direction, what are the actual concrete steps?
Well, it might sound kind of simple, but I think it starts with just questioning our assumptions. The easy answers, they're tempting, but we've really got to look deeper.
Okay, you're going to have to give me an example here. What do you mean?
Take poverty, right?
Oh.
A common narrative is that people are poor because of, some personal failing, a lack of hard work, bad decisions. And listen, personal responsibility is important, but
But that's not the whole story.
exactly, it ignores the massive, and I mean massive, institutional barriers that often keep people trapped in poverty.
It's like that saying, right? You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have any boots.
Exactly. We need to make sure everyone at least has access to some boots. So it's about access to quality education, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about affordable health care, a legal system that's actually fair, genuine opportunities for economic advancement that aren't limited by things like race or gender or, honestly, where you were born.
Yeah, we've got to address all those systemic issues.
It's about creating a system where everyone has a fair shot, not just the folks who were, born on third base.
Right, exactly.
And that's a very different thing than just charity. It's about looking at the rules, the institutions that actually govern our society and saying, hold on a second, who are these rules actually benefiting? Who do they help? Who do they hurt? That's what we have to ask. It's not enough to just, kind of tinker on the edges.
No, we've got to fundamentally rethink how these systems are set up in the first place.
100%.
Because that's the thing, right? Like these systems, these institutions, they weren't, handed down on stone tablets from a mountaintop. Like they were created by people, which means...
We can change them.
Exactly.
And honestly, that's where I find hope. Because it's not about just accepting the status quo. It's about having the courage to imagine something different, to fight for a better future. It's about holding our leaders accountable for creating a world where everyone actually has a genuine opportunity to thrive, to actually make something of their lives.
It's about writing a new ending to the story.
Exactly. And that's a story I think we can all get behind.
Well, listen, this has been a wild ride. It's been super interesting exploring all of this with you.
Lots to think about. Yeah, it's been a pleasure being here.
Any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to kind of chew on as they go about their day?
I think if there's one thing I really hope you take away from this deep dive, it's this. Don't get overwhelmed by all the bad stuff, by how big these problems are.
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed.
It is, but it shouldn't make you want to check out. It should make you want to lean in.
I love that.
Stay curious. Stay engaged. Don't for a second underestimate your own ability to make a difference.
Because we all have power.
We do. Every single one of us.
We might not all be, politicians or economists or whatever, but we can all be informed citizens, right? We can be engaged members of our communities.
Yes.
We can all play a part in building a more just and a more prosperous future. And you know what? It starts with stuff like this. Having these conversations, reading books like Why Nations Fail. So thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.
See you then.